Greetings, friends and family, from Mrs. Giotti's Airbnb in Aliport, Calcutta, or as they say nowadays, Kolkata. My room is above the garage, and it's a very quiet, peaceful neighborhood. But it is Kolkata, and Kolkata can be strange. Can't really say I understand what all this means, but it is a pretty trippy walk to work. So you might be wondering, just what am I doing in India? Well, I'm doing research for my next book, and in particular a chapter on my work with the War Widows Association of India. In 1974, I went to work for Mrs. S.A. Chaudhri, one of the board members of the India War Widows Association. The War Widows Association was organized in 1971 to obviously help the war widows of India, particularly the Hindu war widows. To give you some background, India fought several wars in the 60s and in the early 70s. They lost most of those wars, and some of them they suffered terrible casualties, not just with their enlisted men, but with their officers. Now, Mrs. Chaudhri was particularly concerned with the widows of officers because she felt that they would suffer the most from the really draconian customs and laws regarding Hindu widows. In India, at the time I was working for Mrs. Chaudhri at the War Widows Association, it was illegal in I believe it was all states of India, for a widow to remarry. It would be a scandal for the family, a scandal for the community. A widow, even though she might be in her late teens or early 20s, was basically to go to her husband's family and become, in most situations, a personal servant of her mother-in-law. She had no property rights, not even rights to her children, and was often, in the most severe cases, just relegated to the servants' quarters and lived the rest of her life as one of the poor relatives or servants of the family. So what Mrs. Chaudhri and I did was interview these war widows. Mrs. Chaudhri was particularly concerned with the widows of officers because they were, generally speaking, well educated, well aware of their plight, very, very much aware of how unjust it was, and she felt that they were the ones who would suffer the most from these customs and laws. The young widows that we were interviewing, most of them were beautiful. Many of them had small children. Many of them were university educated. It was just a disaster that they were facing, and most of them were terrified. So Mrs. Chaudhri and I would interview them, and then we would publish matrimonial ads for them in the Times of India, in English, of course. And this was all done without their families knowing anything about this, because they would be severely punished if it was known that they were breaking laws and customs. So I'm in India researching at the National Library digging up all of the old matrimonials that I wrote. I didn't keep any of them. And then also doing research, more research into the plight of Hindu widows in the 60s and 70s in India. I think this is a fascinating chapter for my book. I think it's a fascinating chapter in world history, women's liberation, and just, I would say, enlightenment in general.